My focus will look at cultural competence, and you may also hear me say cultural and linguistic competence, but we use both, and what those perspectives are from the United States. And I first want to acknowledge that I am on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and that this land has always been a learning space for many Aboriginal nations. The Georgetown University National Center for Cultural Competence is humbled to share a partnership with the University of Sydney National Center for Cultural Competence and to learn and benefit from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander knowledge, which is one of the oldest knowledge systems on Earth. And I'm very privileged, and I'm using that in an affirmative way, to be here today and to be able to work with Juanita and Leanne and Gabby and Emma and many other people within the center. So I wanted to start off, first of all, saying that the tenets of cultural competence, they're not new. And if you look at some nursing texts from way back in the day, there's a quote from a nurse in 1940 that basically says, I can't really treat these individuals until I know something about their culture. So it really isn't new. We started to hear the term cultural competence in the 1980s. I know that one of our previous speakers spoke about a particular model, it's a cross model. I will talk about that overall. We also have seen the use of the term cultural competence evolve from very little that's in the published literature to reams of such references going forward. So again, this is not new. We've seen it largely in the health professions and mental health professions and in education. I would say overall, institutions of higher education have been very slow to adopt what is cultural competence and what does it mean within the context. So we see that many institutions of higher education have not examined the implications of cultural competence across all disciplines and fields of study. For instance, what does it have to do with science? We heard the example about cells. And then also to be able to embed the values, the policies, and practices of cultural competence across the core functions within academia. So in other words, it lives here, or it may live here, but it certainly doesn't live in all of our functions within academia, including looking at research, looking at community engagement, looking at curricula development and enhancement. So given that overview, this keynote is going to work on 3 objectives. One is I want to really build upon and commend the University of Sydney and the National Center for the theme of this conference. It was very compelling for me in terms of thinking about how we put together this presentation. But to really look at what are the current day dilemmas related to cultural competence facing institutions of higher education in the United States. They may be similar to some of the things that we see here in Australia. Explore the gaps between policies that support cultural competence and the practices that foster its actual implementation, and to describe the initiatives of our Georgetown University National Center for Cultural Competence, specifically focusing on advancing and sustaining cultural and linguistic competence in institutions of higher education. So I'm going to start off with this phrase, if truth be told. My mother used to say that, and I knew when she said that I was in trouble. And so if we look at if truth be told, what some in academia believe and think and say about cultural competence, it's something that we have to give lip service to. All of these quotes are actual. I've documented them and written them down, and I work in the United States. It's really simply a passing trend. We do not have resources to devote to this. There's not enough time to begin yet another new thing. Meanwhile, remember, it's not new. It is not part of my formal academic training. What is the relevance of this to hard science? true sciences. Isn't there an app for that? I already took that workshop. Is there even any true evidence? So these are things that we hear about cultural competence. Perhaps not in Australia, but we certainly do hear it in the United States. And so based on that, there's so many dilemmas. I chose to focus on only 3. There's no agreed upon definition of what cultural competence is in the literature and within institutions of higher education. And we heard that stated here before. There's not consensus, I would say, in terms of what cultural competence is. That interdisciplinary faculty may neither have the knowledge, skills, nor level of comfort to include cultural competence, content related to cultural competence, in their academic endeavors. And when I use the term faculty in the United States, faculty are the people. I know that in Australia we talk about the faculty as being the body of knowledge. As I say this, I will be speaking about the people. And inadequate leadership and organizational capacity to close the gap between stated policy and implementation. So there's a bunch of terms that are here that we see in the literature. And I clearly agree with your presentation. They're used interchangeably, and they're significantly used interchangeably across the board. And I may use the term cultural competence, you may use the term cultural competence, but we're not talking about the same thing. And so, again, there's not been consensus reached on what it is. I think now in my career, I don't really care what you call it. But I want to see a conceptual framework. I want to see it very well defined, and it would need to have certain elements. And so, again, as I look at cultural awareness, cultural sensitivity, and recently I was on an advisory group, and they used the term cultural dexterity. So I'm like, what is that? And actually, it was from surgeons, because they felt that other surgeons would not accept the term cultural competence, and that dexterity was important to surgeons, so therefore they were going to create like yet another new term. And so we have all of these terms that people use to refer to it. I think it's really important that we're on the same page, however one may define it. So I want to use the framework from Terry Cross, Barbara Bazaron, Paul Dennis, Marisa Isaacson. There's one person whose name was not included in this, James Mason. I always acknowledge his work. He did significant writing on this, and his name was inadvertently left from that monograph. It's a long story, but I always have to give a shout out to James Mason and this work. And so this is the framework for cultural competence that I will use, and as I use this is how I will be thinking about it and referring to it. It guides all of our work at the National Center. And so as we think about cultural competence, first of all, it requires that organizations, and I'm starting with the organizational level, not at an individual level, it requires that we first have clearly defined and a congruent set of values and principles. This is really key and critical, because oftentimes there may be espoused values, but they're not congruent with how people behave. And so as we look at this concept of cultural competence, there has to be these congruent set of values and principles. Also, the organizations must indeed demonstrate behaviors, have attitudes, policies, structures, and practices that will enable them to work effectively cross-culturally. And we do say cross-culturally, not cross-racially, and not cross-ethnically, if we're talking about culture. And oftentimes, people are really talking about race or ethnicity. They're not talking about culture. So we're going to talk about culture this afternoon. If we think of the 5 elements of cultural competence that was espoused in the Cross model, I want to get an echo here. One of the first elements is being able to acknowledge cultural differences. And that's happened here today. We've heard this to a great degree. I would say for some people it's hard to acknowledge cultural differences. I'm going to say, especially in the United States and within the social cultural context that we find ourselves in, in our country, and they say so that people are afraid to acknowledge cultural differences. They don't want to be accused of perhaps being insensitive or even worse, being racist, and so that they kind of ignore these cultural differences. Like if you just ignore them, perhaps they will just go away. At the next level is being able to understand your own culture. It's very difficult to talk about understanding the cultures of others if you don't first understand your own culture. And when I say that, I don't necessarily always mean your family of birth. You are very much influenced by that, but you're also influenced by the culture, the discipline in which you're trained. It influences how you think. It influences the language that you use. It influences your circle of colleagues and friends. And so that when we talk about culture, we really are looking at culture and understanding your own culture from those multiple perspectives. So I self-identify as African American. I'm influenced by the culture of my family of origin. I grew up in Washington, D.C. I'm also influenced by the disciplines that I studied, which was education and human development. It influences how I view the world. I'm influenced by the fact that I've worked at an academic center, at a medical center for many, many years. So these are all things that really influence my worldview and who I am. The next element is being able to engage in self-assessment. This is a critical area when we think about cultural competence. So sometimes we do this in a very formal way to engage in self-assessment. We use checklists and tools and those kinds of things. But we also can just really think about how we may self-reflect. You have an interaction with someone. It doesn't go well. And you have to really think about it. What was that about? You know, what were the cultural implications? You know, did it interfere with communication? So this whole capacity to step back and to engage in self-assessment, again, at the individual level, is key and critical to cultural competence. Fourth element is to acquire cultural knowledge and skills. And I say this sometimes a little tongue-in-cheek, that sometimes people just think that you get cultural competence by osmosis, you know, just like being present in the environment. And what we say about cultural competence is it is intentional, that you work at this. So it is intentional that you are acquiring knowledge about individuals, about communities, about systems that may be different than your own. And so, again, it is intentional. And our fifth element is being able to view behavior within a cultural context. And again, this is really key and critical, that you may hear, especially in a healthcare setting, that there's judgments about someone that did not adhere to medication regimen or follow some instructions, without really understanding the social cultural context in which that person may have to function, what's going on with their family. And so that we do have to view behavior in a cultural context, because no matter how odd a behavior may seem or be, that there's some underlying reason for that behavior, and usually it is indeed culturally based. So this is the framework as we think about cultural competence at the National Center, but now I want to look at what might that look like in an institution of higher education, and particularly looking at that at the individual staff or faculty level. So this is what we'd like to see, that these individuals would demonstrate a genuine interest and commitment to the concept of cultural competence. And the second one is to admit and identify areas of professional growth. That's really hard in academia, particularly for people who are at the pinnacle of their career. They're noted researchers. So how is it that they're needing to have this new area of professional growth? And so again, that's a very key area. It also looks at this whole concept of cultural humility. Demonstrate a willingness and capacity to address the dynamics of difference, because we're all different. We all are different. And so that we have to acknowledge that in terms of our teaching, in terms of research, how we interact with our colleagues, how we engage communities, but we have to be able to look at difference, and that difference isn't a bad thing. To be able to seek and use cultural knowledge effectively. Sometimes in academia, people are acquiring knowledge for the sake of acquiring knowledge. I'm going to say that again. Sometimes people are seeking and acquiring knowledge just for the fact to say, I have this knowledge. What is it that you do with it? How is it conveyed to others? Most importantly, how does it help people? And so again, as we think about that element. And then lastly, looking at being able to demonstrate these capacities, the whole concept of cultural competence at multiple levels within your own particular discipline. And that would include in curricula, in teaching and supervision, in mentoring, instructional technology. And that was hard for some of our own faculty to get with instructional technology because they're used to teaching one particular way. And as if that embedding cultural competence is going to be different in instructional technology than it would be in face-to-face. So again, being able to move that, how we engage in research and evaluation, and then community engagement. And these are just some of the areas that we would think about in terms of faculty, staff, and others. So if we think about the 5 elements of cultural competence at an organizational level, organizations, including institutions of higher education, have to value diversity. Now, I would say that many institutions say that. It's in their mission statement. It may even be in some of their principles. However, valuing diversity isn't necessarily synonymous with demonstrating that valuing in terms of who works, teaches, and conducts research within that academic institution, so that we don't always see the racial, ethnic, and cultural diversity, particularly at higher levels of the university, as espoused by what their principles may indeed be. So again, looking at valuing diversity. The next level is to be able to conduct self-assessment. And we've created a number of tools and instruments to be able to engage in conducting self-assessment for a variety of organizations. It's hard to talk about moving toward cultural competence when we don't have a base. We don't really know where we're starting. We don't know what our strengths are. We don't know what our assets are. And we tend never to say what our weaknesses are. People just simply don't want to hear they're weak in cultural competence. They don't want to hear it. So we tend to frame it to say your areas for growth. And how could any academic institution or professional say that there isn't room for growth? And so again, being able to collect data to see and measure where you are. The third element at an organizational level is being able to manage the dynamics of difference. And that's really key and critical because we're all human beings, we're all different, and we bring those to work. It's not as if like, you know, I'm different only at home, and then when I come to university, like I blend in and I'm the same. There are many issues that occur because we cannot manage and understand and address these dynamics of difference. So that's another key area when we think about cultural competence at an organizational level. From the original framework, Terry Cross and et al., they use the term institutionalized. And because I work with and on behalf of people with developmental and other disabilities, that term is it's not an okay term because people have been, quote, forced to be institutionalized against their will. So I have amended the framework and used the term embed and in addition to institutionalize. So we have to be able to embed or institutionalize cultural knowledge. In the United States, there's often someone who's been delegated within an academic setting or even within a program that you're the cultural competence person, or you're the diversity person, or you're the equity person, and that everything rests with that one individual. So I suggest to you that when you do that level of investment, and then the person decides, I'm leaving, I'm coming to Sydney, I'm leaving the United States. Where does that leave the organization? That leaves the organization pretty much back where it started from, because that knowledge has not been spread throughout the program or throughout the institution, and it walks out the door with that individual. And so as we think about this notion of embedding cultural knowledge, it's key for everyone. It can't just rest with certain people. It is all of our work to address cultural competence. And then lastly, at the organizational level, we have to be able to adapt to diversity. And that's in terms of the values that we have. They have to be revisited. Our policies, structures, services, and practices. And so again, this is the framework when we're thinking about cultural competence, not just as what individuals do, but what organizations and programs and systems do. So let's look at that at institutional level, at the academic level. So one of the things that we'd like to see is that cultural competence is integral to the core values and mission of the university. Oftentimes, again, people say it, but it's not really true in terms of practice. That the campus climate embraces and respects and practices cultural competence. In other words, we heard earlier, someone talks the talk, but this is about walking the talk. That there's committed leadership, and there's also commitment to leadership development, so that we're bringing others along. That it is supported by organizational policies, structures, procedures, and resources. And I really want to emphasize resources, because you can't do this without resources, whether that's fiscal resources or people resources. That there has to be a commitment and a capacity to address the isms. And I'm putting a lot of things in that category: racism, homophobia, the kind of biases that we see. There are a lot of things that can fall under the umbrella of the isms. You cannot do the work of cultural competence unless you have the willingness and the capacity to address the isms, because they're alive and well, at least in the United States. Okay. That again, recognizing and embracing community engagement, and not just because we're engaging communities, but to be able to truly acknowledge, accept, and embrace the fact of looking at communities as huge sources of knowledge, and that there's a reciprocal transfer, we think, of knowledge and skills between universities and Indigenous or other communities. And so this is another key and very critical aspect, that we're not just studying communities and conducting research on communities, that we are engaged with communities to be involved with them in a way that they think is most appropriate. And then lastly, recognition and incentives for scholarly excellence. Because there's a body of knowledge and there's huge scholarship in the area of cultural competence, but it may not get the same attention as other areas. And so again, this is looking at cultural competence from that perspective. As we think about cultural competence, if we've just described it, that these elements have to be at every level of an institution, at the policymaking level, the administration level, at the practice, teaching, research, and other academic functions level, for students, for fellows, for faculty, for staff, for volunteers and other academic partners, and for communities and their members. And so I would say to you, if you look at the literature, and even as I've been listening in here, we've focused a lot on training, and I think that's part of the issue, is that we've not done a lot of research on what cultural competence looks like in academic settings at these multiple levels, that we have focused on training. And I would say that it is really important to conduct training. It doesn't get you to cultural competence at an organizational or system level. And so as we look at this, policymaking, administration, practice, service, validity, looking at students, fellows, and communities and their members, that if we're moving toward true cultural competence, we are impacting each and every one of these levels. I like to say it's very difficult to be a culturally competent professor or a lecturer in an organization that does not support you with policies, procedures, and resources, because you can only go so far. So it's important for us to think about cultural competence not just at the individual level, but again, to think of it systemically. The CLC is cultural and linguistic competence, because again, we have a number of laws and other kinds of things, and we focus on linguistic competence as well. And so in some areas, we think about cultural competence in academic institutions and others. It's thinking of what are the core functions within academia. What do you do? And how does cultural competence relate to that? Human resources and staff development, who you are, who comprises this organization, how does cultural competence relate to that? Collaboration and community engagement, who are your partners? What do they look like? What are their values? How does cultural competence relate to that? Fiscal resources and allocation. This is really important. Where does the money go? How is the money spent? And is there equity in terms of how resources are allocated for cultural competence compared to other things? And I again commend the University of Sydney for the resources it has invested in its National Center for Cultural Competence. And then lastly, looking at contracts. Who do we trust to deliver university services and supports on your own behalf? So in other words, they're representing University of Sydney or some other university, and they're representing you. So if we're contracting for the service, how are we holding our contractors accountable for our own values related to cultural competence overall? So I want to share with you what we've learned about supporting universities and helping universities move forward as it relates to cultural and linguistic competence in the U.S. So in addition to the National Center for Cultural Competence, I'm also the director of our University Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities. And since it's a mouthful, everybody just calls them UCEDs. So I hope you can get with that acronym. So these programs are legislatively mandated. So in other words, there's policy to say that they have to be in existence. And they're federally funded in every state in the United States and also in the U.S. territories. So altogether, there are 67 UCEDs in both public and private universities. These UCEDs have these 4 core functions. They have to conduct pre-service interdisciplinary training and continuing education. They have to engage in community services, research and evaluation, and also information dissemination. These are, I think, very typical things that we see within universities. And Georgetown University is the UCED, designated UCED for the District of Columbia, better known as Washington, D.C. Yeah, in fact, when I checked in the hotel, the person was asking me what was the District of Columbia. And I said, it's Washington, D.C. He had not seen that term before. So one of the projects that we have funded is called Embedding Cultural Diversity and Cultural Linguistic Competence in UCED curriculum and training activities. So if we look at policy, in 2000, there's authorizing federal policy that requires cultural competence in all UCED programs and activities. So that was in 2000. And so our long-term goal was to support UCEDs to better integrate cultural and linguistic competence across its core functions. And we did a number of things in terms of gathering data and to find out what were these programs actually doing. So we partner with Georgia State University, our own UCED, our National Center for Cultural Competence, and we did an interview, structured interviews of 61 of the 67 UCED directors in these programs in 2017, just to find out, like, what were directors doing, what were they actually doing in this area. And so what we found out was this whole notion of how do you conceptualize and define cultural competence is that the overwhelming majority of the directors really gave us responses about cultural competence that were actually cultural diversity. Actually, I mean, no place near the conceptualization and the framework that I just shared as it relates to cultural competence. And then they also cited like really personal need to respond to cultural differences, but they certainly did not talk about the kind of infrastructure, the kind of policies that need to be in place in order to support those overall. So that if we had these 67 programs that were required to do this, and the directors really didn't have an understanding of what this is, that it's no, I don't know, it's no surprise that we haven't made as much progress in this area overall. We also asked those directors to tell us, do you believe that there's a shared understanding of cultural competence in your University Center for Excellence? And while the directors indicated, to some extent, say 42% indicated, oh yes, there's a shared understanding, we'd still have to say a shared understanding of what, since they did not really conceptualize it in that way. But most, indeed, over half said that there was no shared understanding of cultural competence or somewhat among the faculty and staff that were in these programs. We also asked them what were the barriers to cultural competence within their programs, and in particular looking at their curricula. most said time, and absolutely most said time. Some also said funding. A number talked about mindset, that people did not have the correct mindset and commitment to go forward. Some talked about the lack of racial, ethnic, and cultural diversity, and as if because there's a lack of racial, ethnic, and cultural diversity, that there can't be cultural competence. Also, another barrier was measurement, and then lastly, work within communities. And so this was a significant study, at least within our network, because in all of these years, no one had ever asked directors what they thought about cultural competence, how it was manifested within their programs. So now we have, quote, data to be able to share within the network, and also our federal funders to say this is not happening. We also saw that there is a substantial gap between what is required by policy and what actually takes place in terms of implementing cultural and linguistic competence. So that as we talked about and looked at this theme in terms of dilemmas, policy, and then practice, that just because you have a policy doesn't mean that things happen. And so a colleague always likes to say policy is necessary, but not sufficient. And then lastly, as we think about cultural competence within any setting, in particular in academia, that there has to be the notion of that things have to change. And as we think about curricula and we think about training, and we think just by providing, quote, knowledge and information that we're going to get to change, that's really not been our experience. And so that we're coupling all of our training activities with individual and organizational change frameworks, because you've got to change behavior, and just giving information does not change behavior. So I want to share with you some of our practices, what we're engaged in, and it's from 3 separate projects. One is our Leadership Institute for Cultural Diversity and Cultural Competence, of which Juanita and Gabby have participated. It's a year-long experience, fairly intensive. Our Embedding project that I just shared with you, embedding cultural diversity and cultural and linguistic competence in curriculum training activities. And lastly, our community of practice. So those are the 3 that we will speak to. These are ways that we're looking at moving from theory to practice. And these are the areas that we focused on. Curriculum development, leadership development, faculty and staff professional development, mentoring, looking at contributing to both the gray and juried literature, and global dissemination of our resources and tools. So again, these are our areas of focus. What we've seen in terms of areas of impact has really been to enrich student faculty knowledge and skills, to embed cultural and linguistic competence in curricula and training activities, positively impact the climate of the learning environment, confront and address the isms, engage culturally and linguistically diverse communities in academic endeavors, use individual and behavioral change theories to underpin our cultural and linguistic competence initiatives, to gain buy-in and influence leaders, and to move from theory to action and implementation. Just want to share quickly in terms of leaders. As we think about leaders, many people think of hierarchical leadership and appointed leaders. Our view is that anyone can be a leader. You lead from where you be. If that's the front desk, and I've seen a lot of leadership at the front desk in many settings, that we all have a role to play and we can all lead with this. So I just want to say a little bit about campus climate, because we've had a number of incidents in the US where there's been increased over demonstrations of racism and other isms, hanging nooses, just a range of things that that are just despicable that have happened on campuses. So I want to talk a little bit about the campus environment and define that just a little bit. And so as we think about campus climate, and you can think about this at University of Sydney and other universities, campus climate is a measure, real or perceived, of the campus environment as it relates to interpersonal, academic, and professional interactions. In a healthy climate, individuals and groups generally feel welcomed, respected, and valued by the university. A healthy climate is grounded in respect for others, nurtured by dialogue between those of differing perspectives, and evidenced by a pattern of civil interactions among community members. A healthy climate may at times lead to discomfort, as members of the community confront uncomfortable situations in ways that lead to growth, to change, and understanding. The major features of campus climate are primary emphasis on common participant views of a wide array of organizational phenomena that allow for comparisons among groups over time, focus on current patterns and beliefs and behaviors, and often ephemeral or malleable character, so that we see that climate is pervasive, is potentially inclusive of a broader array of organizational phenomena. And the authors of this work describe 3 categories of climate, and I'm encouraging you to think about your own universities with this. It's the objective climate, the perceived climate, and the psychological or felt climate. And to think about what this means for students, for faculty, and for staff across diverse racial and cultural groups. We also know from the literature that poor climate in academic settings has been linked to alienation, poor integration, poor academic performance, and problems with academic, personal, and emotional adjustments for racially and ethnically diverse students. And so as we think about this notion of cultural competence, for us to think about what does it mean in terms of the climate of the learning environment. And so as some of our work is focused on that we know that cultural competence can raise cultural awareness among students and faculty and staff, increase knowledge and skills among students, faculty, staff to interact positively with people from cultures other than their own, to increase knowledge and skills to recognize and manage cross-cultural conflicts, all of which we've talked about today, to define and describe approaches to mitigate the effect of the isms, help instill a sense of social justice to advocate and address inequities within the university climate, and to integrate content on and curricula and coursework and teaching methodologies, research, and community engagement. And so just a note in terms of how we're looking at the isms. It's an umbrella term used to refer to a broad range of attitudes and behaviors that involve perceived superiority, oppression, prejudice, discrimination, that's based on such factors as race, national origin, gender identity and expression, language, class, disability, etc. So as I'm looking at terms of the isms, it's not limited to race or ethnicity. It's a much broader term. So as we think about some of the project outcomes from our embedding project, one of the things that we did was to do a first national inventory of cultural and linguistic competence and diversity resources that were developed. Again, we're looking at disability. And so that had never happened before, that we had a chance to vet these materials. And we came up with vetting criteria. And as we looked at those materials, that they had not really, I'm not saying they've been thrown together, but I would certainly say that there had not been consistent thought in what would be the content, and had this big label, this is cultural competence training. In fact, almost everything went under the umbrella of cultural competence training. And I would look to say, well, what is it that's culturally competent? And it, in many instances, it wasn't there. We also came up with a set of national recommendations that helped our network to really look at what should be included in curricula and training activities across these core functions. And lastly, again, looking at individual and organizational change, we looked at embedding that to say, if you want to get from one space to another space, how do you do these change theories? So for instance, if we're looking at engaging individuals within certain communities, so you'd have maybe some folks who didn't want to go into certain communities to deliver services and supports. So it's really important to know Are people afraid to go into those communities? It's really important to know whether or not folks don't want to serve members of that community, because your intervention is going to be different. Or whether or not someone just doesn't know and understand the community, and therefore that's why they are reluctant. So our project goal for this particular project, and again, we had 2 years to do this work. It really should not have been a one-year funded project. But one of the things that we were doing is, again, to work with faculty and staff to be able to integrate principles and practices of cultural and linguistic competence across these core functions. And so in our current year that we're working on now is that we're doing some consultation, we're doing professional development, and we're providing technical assistance, again, to help folks use the tools and resources that we've created and to begin to effect change. These are our project team members. We collaborated with partners from across the United States and other USETs, including Minnesota, Vermont, Colorado, Georgia, and Georgia State. We're also partnering with our national association to be able to get this work done. And so we're using a 3-tiered framework, and one of the tiers is to provide intensive on-site technical assistance and select 4 of these USETs across the country to receive this intensive technical assistance. That would be faculty development. It's working with them and examining and changing their curricula. We're also looking at and have started individual consultation to help those programs vet their curricula, to say, what is it that we're teaching students, to create new curricula, adapt curricula, and training activities. And then lastly, we have what we're calling universal access, so that we have webinars, website and network meetings where these tools and resources are disseminated. So again, some of the accomplishments for our embedding project is, again, that there were tools that were created to help folks do this work. Many people want to do the work, they don't have the tools to do the work. And so that was one area that we wanted to focus on. The other thing that we found when we did an environmental scan of the juried literature is that these USEDs are the premier networks within the United States to train disability professionals. But when we looked at the juried literature, what we saw is that that premier network wasn't contributing to this literature. It was coming from other sources. So these are data that you could hold up very high to say, we have policy, we've had policy for a long time, but our network is not doing the work. We also did an environmental scan to identify the materials that folks were using in curricula. And we asked all of the directors, send us your top 5 resources, curriculum and training activities in cultural competence. And initially we only got 3. Our project officer at the feds nudged them a little bit more, and so then we got more. We got 36 altogether, and we wound up vetting only 26. The others we chose not to vet. And so we're able to look at those materials, see what their strengths are based on the vetting material, have them posted on a website, have them accessible for other programs to be able to use and to be able to adapt. And lastly, I shared with you, we had done the director's interview. And so we have a series of tools, I think, again, I'll be sharing with the National Center. One is to really look at, if you're teaching anything in this area, you're providing any training, what are the core curriculum content areas that should be involved or to be included? So we've done one on leadership, one on linguistic competence, and again, that's an area that we focus on. Pre-service training and continuing education. We did 2, one looking at the individual level and at the organizational level. We've put together, again, a very nice compendium of change frameworks. And when I get back to Washington, D.C., because I am behind, we will do more. And that includes research and evaluation, information dissemination, and community services. So many of these tools are right now posted on the website, and you're able to access them to, again, look at what are core curricular content areas. This is the website. Just wanted to give you a screenshot of what that looks like, where you can access the curricula that we vetted any of the reports that we've done, and also the tools that I've just described. And so just between our project period, from December to February, we have to report every 6 months. This is the, I'm going to say, the global dissemination that we have witnessed. So that we've had, through our web analytics, many visitors, almost 150,000 that have visited the website. And of those, 131,000 were unique visitors. We're able to see what pages that they're going to and what countries they're from. So I'm proud to say Australia has visited, along with other countries and regions, including Washington, D.C., and then we're looking at what are the areas of interest that people are seeking. Quickly, I'd like to share with you our Leadership Institute. It's a 5-year funded program that really looks at how do we develop leadership for cultural and linguistic competence, again, within a disability community. So we have a number of objectives that we've been working there, and I'd just like to share with you some of the outcomes. We created the first vetted model curriculum specifically designed to support leadership and cultural diversity for disability-specific organizations. So far, we've had 84 individuals complete. We're getting ready to go into cohort 4 in May, and that will bring 35 additional participants. They come from across the United States, and again, 2 years, we included a special slot which is reserved just for Australia and the National Center for Cultural Competence. Another component of this is cross-cultural mentoring, so that we feel that it's really important not just to get the training, but to continue to have mentoring and coaching post-training. So we have created a pool of mentors that are not necessarily, quote, cultural competence experts, but this pool of individuals all keep cultural competence within their heart and within their spirit. Some are lawyers, some are communications specialists, but they take time out to mentor individuals about how do you keep this in your life and career goals. We've had some pretty good spread. This is showing the number of participants across the United States that have been involved, including at least one of the territories, which is Puerto Rico. And this is between 2015 and 2017. We worked really very hard for those states where we did not have any participants, and I'm pleased to say in this next cohort, we were able to get Maine in, Alabama in, Mississippi in, and also Utah in terms of participants. Our goal is that we will fill up this map before our project funding ends. We have a fairly deep evaluation strategy in terms of pre and post and ongoing evaluation to see how people are indeed leading their efforts here. I'm just giving you a screenshot here in terms of the data that we collect, is to provide leadership and mobilize change in a challenging environment. And that is exactly what we're experiencing in the United States. And I would say that always in terms of promoting cultural and linguistic competence, it is indeed in a challenging environment. So these are just a couple quotes from our cohorts. This, again, shares some web analytics for the work that we're doing at the National Center for Cultural Competence, specifically the Leadership Institute. And so that we know that the resources that we've created have been accessed by almost all states, 48, from 4 U.S. territories that are named there, and impressively over 40 regions in 25 countries, so that they are accessing through web-based means some of our resources. And in particular, what we've done is to have what we call learning and reflection forums. They're an hour and a half that cover specific content areas, say for instance, leading cultural and linguistic competence or addressing the isms from an organizational perspective. We have those webinars. They generally are involved with a variety of people, and they're posted on the website. And they're always, again, with reflections for leadership. We've now found that many of the academic institutions are having their students log on, review them, and have them as learning assignments. And lastly, our community of practice, so that we're moving from some of the training activities to actually look at systems change. How are we going to change what happens with the systems that impact people with disabilities? And I would say among these 10 states that are participating in this 5-year community of practice, we have representatives from the university's Centers for Excellence in Development of Disabilities overall. So I think this just gives an overview of looking at what some of the dilemmas are, what we know about policy, and also what we know about practice in terms of promoting cultural and linguistic competence. So I'd like to end on this. This is let's see, this is some work that was happening in a small county in Oregon. They felt like they just weren't doing enough to address cultural competence. And this used to say, as a culturally competent manager, we asked permission to change that and have it fill in the blank. And I think it's really very positive in terms of, as a culturally competent, you fill in the blank. I'm capable of positively interacting with people who do not look like, talk like, move like, think like, believe like, act like, love like, live like me. Now, when we first got permission, there were 2 things that weren't there before. And one is move like me. We did this I think in Boston, and a person who uses a wheelchair for primary mobility came up and said, I really like that, but I don't see myself reflected. Can you add move like me? I was like, absolutely. Then in a health disparities course that I do lectures for at Georgetown University, one of the students came up and said, I really like that. Can you add love like me? And I know that there are a lot of like me's that we could add. It's not a whole lot of space left. So right now, I just kind of only have that. And I just think it's eloquent, it's quite powerful to really think about cultural competence in this way. And then lastly, until we as collective cultures can get to where this young lady's t-shirt is, there's much work to be done by all. And in my African American tradition, we say enough said. So again, I thank you for your attention and this invitation today.